Welcoming back Professor Dale Gnidovec, Collections Manager and Curator of the Orton Geological Museum and Professor of Earth Sciences at OSU, who will present a talk titled A Long Time Ago and Far Away, The Geologic History of Ohio. From tropical seas and steamy swamps to glaciers a mile high, join us for a 500 million year journey across the land we call Ohio. So with that, I will leave it to Dale.
Alrighty, can you see my screen and hear me?
We can, or at least I can.
Yep.
Oh, good. Alrighty, well, as the sign says, I'm the curator of the Orton Geological Museum. I work in this wonderful old building, Orton Hall, which was built in 1893, and it was built as a geology building. The layers of rock in the outside are in geological order. Oldest rocks at the bottom and younger towards the top, just like the rocks in Ohio's bedrock. Even the gargoyles up around the bell tower are geologic. Now, lots of buildings have gargoyles. Gargoyles are just carved stone heads. In most buildings, the gargoyles are mythical beasts. They're made up animals. Ours are based on real prehistoric animals. So we've got dinosaurs up there. We've got an ichthyosaur, a pterosaur. We even have a saber-toothed cat up there. Like most museums, we've got all kinds of neat exhibits. Excuse me. This is part of our Minerals of Ohio exhibit, which shows beautiful crystals of fluorite from northwestern Ohio. We've got a whole series of cases that show fossils from the various layers you can find in the state. We've got this wonderful life-size reproduction Tyrannosaurus Rex skull. And about 3 years ago, we got this wonderful addition to our lobby. It's a skeleton of a dinosaur called Cryolophosaurus ellioti, named for Dr. David Elliott, the OSU geology professor who discovered it. And he discovered it in Antarctica. It's the best known dinosaur from that entire continent. It's a 25-foot long early Jurassic carnivore. It was one of the first of the large meat-eating dinosaurs. It beat Tyrannosaurus by 120 million years. Now, the Earth has been around for a long time, and it sort of kept a diary what's happened to it. Each layer of rock is like a page in that diary. Those pages have been ripped, they've been torn, they've been scattered all over. And geologists have had to reassemble this story into the Book of Earth History of the geological time scale, with the oldest chapters at the bottom and the younger chapters towards the top. And here in Ohio, we've got rocks from late in the Ordovician period, around 450 million years ago, to just up into the Permian period, around 250 million years ago. So here in Ohio, we've got about 200 million years of geologic history. And then we're missing about 250 million years. So we're missing a lot of stuff. And then there's some stuff dumped on us by the glaciers at the very end. Now, there are older rocks here in Ohio, but they're deeply buried. You'd have to drill down over 2,500 feet in the west to get to so-called Precambrian rocks, and over 10,000 feet in the east. So we're going to start just with rocks that we can actually see and get our hands on and look at. And they come late in the Ordovician period, around 450 million years ago. And they occur in that sort of mauve or reddish area there on the map, there in southwestern Ohio, around Cincinnati. And again, that was 450 million years ago, and things were very different then. Here's Ohio today. This is the OSU library. You notice it's dry land, and just to the north of the library is this block. And on that block are two brass plaques. And on the one on top, it says that when you're standing there, you're exactly 759 feet above sea level. But if you were there in the Ordovician period, 450 million years ago, you'd be treading water. And you might think, wow, sea level rose 450 feet? That's huge. Well, no. When we're humans, we tend to think on human scales, 1 foot, 5 foot, 10 foot. if you're dealing with Earth history, you've got to think on much bigger scales. Here's a graph called the hypsographic curve, and it just shows how much of our planet's surface is at various elevations. There's a small part of our planet that's very, very high. We call those areas mountains. And there's a small part of our planet that's very, very deep. We call those places the trenches. But notice how much of our planet's surface, at least the land surface, is very close to sea level. So on Earth scale, relatively minor rises in sea level could flood huge areas of what we think should be dry land. And that's why the seas were so high during the Ordovician period. Now, what causes those major changes in sea level? There's two things. One we'll talk about later. What caused this was plate tectonics. You know, when the plates are separating apart, between the two plates, a huge ridge occurs called the mid-ocean ridge. And these are major features on our planet's history, or our planet's surface. They're huge. They're thousands of miles long, 400 miles wide. Now, at times in Earth history like today, when plate tectonics is sort of slow, when things are moving around at about 2 centimeters a year, those mid-ocean ridges are sort of small. But at times in Earth history, the rate has been much higher, 3 times higher. And at those times, those mid-ocean ridges are much bigger. And when they swell like that, they push water out of the ocean basins onto the land. And that's why this is what Ohio looked like 450 million years ago. And that sea was filled with life, all kinds of neat stuff. In fact, southwestern Ohio is world famous for its fossils. Here's a picture from a major geology textbook, and it shows fossils from southwestern Ohio, including Ohio's state fossil. You know, we've got a state bird and a state tree and a state flower. Well, we also have a state fossil. And I'll go to a classroom, or at least I did before COVID, and ask the kids, what's the state fossil of Ohio? And some little kid would pipe up and say, it's the trilobite. And I'll go, grrr. Now, why do I growl at the kid? Well, saying the trilobite is the state fossil of Ohio is sort of like saying, what's the state animal of Ohio? It's the bird. The bird? There are thousands of different kinds of birds, only one of which, the cardinal, is the state bird of Ohio. Similarly, there were thousands of different kinds of trilobites, over 20,000 species. Some were big, some were small, some were smooth, some had spines all over them. Some had great big eyes, some were blind. Thousands of different species, only one of which, this one, a trilobite called Isotylus, is the state fossil of Ohio. And it comes from rocks of the Ordovician period near Cincinnati. Now, if you go back to that block near the main library, it also says that currently we are exactly 40 degrees north of the equator. But back in the Ordovician period, we were very different. We were about 20 degrees from the equator, much closer, but we were south of it. So Ohio was about where Australia is today. And at that time, Pangea was starting to come together. Too many exhibits and stories and stuff start off with Pangea. Everything started together with Pangea. Well, no, before Pangea, the continents were separate. Before that, the continents were together in a previous supercontinent called Rodinia. Before that, the continents were separate. Before that, they were together in a previous supercontinent called Columbia. Before that, the continents were separate. And this was when Pangea was just starting to come together. And every time we got bumped by a microcontinent, it would form some mountains, and those would be eroded, and all that mud got washed here to the west to cover Ohio. And that's why, if you look at the Ordovician rocks here in Ohio, they're layer after thin layer of mudstone and shale and limestone, shale and limestone, shale and limestone. The shale represents muddy water from these eroding mountains, and the limestone represents clear water in between those episodes of uplift and erosion. So that's what the rocks are like in the Ordovician rocks of Ohio. If we go to the next period, the Silurian period, they outcrop in a large area there in purple. Actually, most of it's covered by glacial debris. That dark squiggly line that crosses the state is the glacial boundary. But they're exposed in quarries and road cuts and things like that. And at that time, Ohio was still south of the equator and still under a warm tropical sea. But conditions were a bit different. For some reason, the continents stopped sort of coming together at that time. And instead of having these really dark shale from all that mud being washed here from the Ordovician period of mountain building, the Silurian period rocks are these huge limestones and dolomites representing very clear water like you'd see out in the Bahama area today. And those huge limestones and dolomite are really good for scenery, things like Clifton Gorge or John Bryan State Park. And those rocks also make great building stones. The lower layers of Orton Hall are some of these limestones and dolomite from the Silurian period. It's also in these limestones and dolomites that we get cavities, especially in the northwest part of the state, where all the neat minerals from Ohio are found. Ohio is world famous for fossils. We're famous for our Cincinnati area fossils. We're famous for our fish fossils, and we're famous for Ice Age fossils. We're really not that well known for minerals. I think we're up to something like 43 different ones in the whole state, compared to states like Colorado and California, which have hundreds. But what do you need for good minerals? You usually need volcanoes and mountains. Ohio is a little thin in volcanoes and mountains. So we don't have a wide variety of minerals, but we do have some very pretty ones. I think we've got some of the prettiest fluorite. We've got world-class calcite. And we've got the biggest crystals in the world of this mineral, celestite, strontium sulfate. A few years ago, I was at the British Museum, and there in London is a celestite crystal from Ohio on exhibit. Another thing the Silurian rocks of Ohio produces is salt, especially in the subsurface in the eastern part of the state. Licking County, where I'm about 2 miles from Licking County now. It was named because of the salt licks there. And it would bubble up, and sometimes settlers would boil it away to get the salt needed for preservation. But there's also 2 salt mines in Ohio. Both of them are underneath Lake Erie, about 1,300 feet underneath Lake Erie. One's just off Cleveland, and one's just off a little bit further east, Fairport Harbor. And there are salt beds over 50 feet thick there under Lake Erie. So you can go down underneath Lake Erie and mine the salt. And you're far enough down, you don't have to worry about the lake caving in. Lake Erie is a very shallow Great Lake. Next period is the Devonian period, around 380 million years old. And Devonian period rocks are in this nice bright green stripe that runs up the center of the state. Franklin County, most of you are probably sitting on top of Devonian rocks, at least below the glacial stuff. And Ohio is still south of the equator, about 20 degrees, again, about where Australia is. And we were still under, at least for the early part of the period, under this warm tropical ocean. And it was filled with life. And one of the best places to see Devonian fossils is our state house. It's filled with fossils, and I'm not talking about the legislators. Mm-hmm. It is built out of Columbus limestone from the Devonian period. And twice a year, at least before COVID, I'd run a tour all around the State House, looking at the walls and the steps inside and out, looking at wonderful fossils like this one the little girl's looking at, or this one. Here's a couple horn corals and a snail, sort of a short, fat snail. And here's a tall, thin snail. Those are all at the State House in a rock unit from the Devonian period called the Columbus limestone. And you can follow that same rock unit, the Columbus limestone, all the way up to Kelly's Island, where the famous glacial grooves were carved there in Columbus limestone from the Devonian period. Another place to see Columbus limestone is Ohio caverns. I've been to a number of these pay-to-view caves, and for my money, Ohio caverns is one of the prettiest. It's only about an hour and a quarter from Columbus. It's over by Bell Fountain, and if you haven't been there, you need to go there. And it's in Columbus limestone from the Devonian period. Now, I mentioned that early in the period, we still had these nice clear seas in which we got these limestones deposited. But then we started to get bumped again. And we had a lot of mud coming in. And that formed rocks like the Ohio Shale, which you can see up near Cleveland. You can see at High Banks Metro Park. OSU is underlain by Ohio Shale. And one of the most significant characters of the Ohio Shale are these brown bodies of rock called concretions. And somehow, and I'm not sure how this started, somehow the rumor got started that these were formed by the glaciers. They've got nothing to do with the glaciers whatsoever. They were formed in the soft muds at the bottom of the Devonian Sea. And sometimes, if you crack one of these opens, you'll find fish bones, including fish of this kind, called Dunkleosteus, named for Dr. David Dunkel, who was a paleontologist at the Cleveland Museum many years. The standard skull you see is from a 20-footer. They may have gotten up to 30 or 40 feet. They were monstrous fish, and they're best known from Ohio. At the very top of the Devonian rocks in Ohio, there's a very famous rock unit called the Berea Sandstone. And the Berea Sandstone is famous for three things. First off, it's a major oil producer, especially in the subsurface over in the east of Ohio. Perhaps you're familiar with an actor called Clark Gable, starred in Gone with the Wind. His dad worked in this oil boom here in the late 1890s. His dad was an oil worker there. So that's the first thing the Berea Sandstone is famous for. Second was started by this guy in the 1870s. John Baldwin, who went on to found Baldwin Wallace College, found a way to make economically grindstones. And at one time, that small area around Berea, Ohio, produced 75% of the entire world supply of grindstones. They made them all sizes, from small ones for sharpening scissors up to huge ones for industries. In 1 year, one company shipped 10,000 railroad carloads of these. They went all over the world, North America, South America, Japan. A couple years ago, I was visiting the big iron mines way up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And there in the workshop that they used to sharpen the tools for the mining was a grindstone of Berea sandstone from Ohio. That's the second thing the Berea sandstone is famous for. Third thing is building stones. The deepest sandstone quarries in the world are in Berea sandstone. And at one time, it supplied a good part of the building stone here in North America. Buildings all over North America are made out of Berea sandstone. It's also great for carving. It's what's called a freestone. You can carve it in any direction. It's shown by that thing in the lower right. The thing in the middle is a neat bridge up at Cleveland that's carved in Berea sandstone. The upper portions of my building, Orton Hall, are Berea sandstone. Buffalo City Hall is Buffalo, New York, and is Berea sandstone. The Parliament buildings in Ottawa are Berea sandstone from Ohio. The Michigan State Capitol building is built out of Berea sandstone from Ohio. Right. Next period is the Mississippian period. Now, in most of the world, the Mississippian is combined with the following period, the Pennsylvanian, and the one called the Carboniferous. And recently that was made official here in the United States as well. But it's still useful to keep them separate, at least for this talk. And the Mississippian rocks are in that sort of olive green that goes up a little bit east of here. And the most famous rock unit in Mississippian period rocks of Ohio is one called the Black Hand Sandstone, named after a black hand that the Indians had painted on the wall of Licking Gorge. And you've all seen the Black Hand Sandstone if you've been to the Hocking Hills and walked around Old Man's Cave. That's Black Hand Sandstone, or Ash Cave. The Black Hand was deposited in a series of deep valleys there that had been eroded during the previous episode of erosion. Now they're being filled by debris from the rising Appalachians. And that's why they can be very, very thick in one area and very thin just a mile or two away. So in these deep valleys, they're very thick, and a little bit later they could be. If you've been to Rising Park in Lancaster, it's a good example of that. Out of nowhere, this great big hill of sandstone sort of rises out. Next period, the Pennsylvanian, or the later part of the Carboniferous. And that's exposed in a wide area on the eastern part of the state. And at this time, things were quite different. Things were a lot of swamps in that area. We were very close to sea level. So Ohio may have looked like the Great Dismal Swamp, or may have looked like the Okefenokee Swamp. Excuse me. And all those trees growing in and around those swamps would fall in and get buried, and eventually turned into Ohio's greatest energy resource, coal. If you look at the coal beds here in Ohio, they occur in a very interesting pattern. All right. They start off with a bunch of freshwater deposits. Then there's a bed of coal. Then there's a bunch of ocean deposits. And then the pattern repeats itself: freshwater, coal, ocean. Freshwater, coal, ocean. So it looks like the sea came in and the sea went out. The sea came in and the sea went out. The sea came in and the sea went out. Over 50 times during the Pennsylvanian period. Each time forming one of these packages of rock with a bed of coal in the middle. Now, what would cause sea level to go up and down like that? Well, this occurred much too quickly to be driven by plate tectonics. These rises in sea levels are caused by glaciers. Right? Where does the water for a glacier come from? It comes from out of the oceans. It's evaporated out, and normally it flows back in. But if you don't let it flow back in, you freeze it on land. And a glacier, I mean, some of these are huge. There's a person there for scale. All right. Don't let it get back in. Sea level is going to go down. When the ice melts, where does the water go? Back into the ocean. So sea level rises. And those comings and goings of the glaciers are what caused these multiple coal beds in Ohio. But the glaciers that were causing sea levels to go up and down here in Ohio weren't anywhere near Ohio. At that time, Ohio was at the equator. The glaciers that were causing sea level to go up and down were in Africa, which at that time was at the South Pole. There's a very famous fossil site in Pennsylvania time rocks of Ohio. It's called the Linton site. It was discovered by this guy, John Strong Newberry, the second state geologist of Ohio. Isn't he a cool looking dude? Man, I just love that look. I wish I could do that. Can't pull it off. But he's just such a cool dude. World famous site. It's loaded with fish fossils. And also we've got the world's second oldest reptile fossil known anywhere on the planet. But if it's so famous, why haven't you seen it in museums? Well, they're black fossils on black rock. They just don't show well. I've got a whole cabinet of them at the Orton Museum. I don't have a single one on exhibit. They just don't show. But every major museum has fossils from the Linton, but you don't show it. So there's the second oldest reptile known anywhere in the planet. They also, in those swamps, were inhabited by giant salamander type animals called labyrinthodonts, and also some of these kind of things. Now, I would love to go back in time and see a herd of dinosaurs migrating. I would pay big money for something like that. but you couldn't pay me enough to go back to the Pennsylvanian period. I don't mind snakes. I dealt with rattlesnakes out in Montana for years. I don't mind rats and mice. I think they're kind of cute, but I don't like bugs. And in the Pennsylvanian period, there were some big bugs. There was a dragonfly with a 2-foot wingspan. No, thank you. There was a millipede that was 5 feet long. No, thank you. I'm not going back to the Pennsylvanian period. Pennsylvanian period rocks also contain the famous flint that Ohio is famous for. Flint Ridge flint has been found all over North America, traded by the Indians. It's also used today by lapidaries to make some beautiful jewelry. Pennsylvanian period rocks are also known for their clay deposits, which fueled a huge brick industry. At one time, Ohio was the clay and brick capital of the world. One company in Canton, Ohio, made 90 million bricks in 1 year. That was between the world wars when cities were paving their streets with bricks. In fact, the Pro Football Hall of Fame sits in an old brickyard. And even today, Ohio is still a major producer of brick. This is Belden brick from over near Newark, and still produces a lot of tile products as well. Another thing the Pennsylvanian period rocks of Ohio were famous for was iron. In the early 1800s, over 50 iron furnaces were built in the southeast corner of the state. And some of them are still standing. And one of them was even reconstructed by the Ohio history people. And you can go there and see how iron was made there. They poured the ore and charcoal by wheelbarrows in the top, set it on fire, and a few days later, they poured the iron out the bottom. And Ohio is really famous for the quality of its iron. The British bought huge amounts of Ohio iron for use as arms in the Crimean War. And then during our American Civil War, it was used for things like a famous cannon called the Swamp Angel, which threw a shell farther than any other cannon had ever done at that time. And Ohio iron was also used on the famous Monitor, one of the two combatants in the first battle between ironclad ships, 1862. So there's the turret of the Monitor, and those cannonball dents are in Ohio iron in the southeast corner of the state. But shortly after the war, the big iron deposits up in Minnesota were discovered, and Ohio's iron industry just quickly collapsed. Next period or chapter of our history is the Permian period, named for the Perm Basin in Russia. And we just have a sliver of Permian rocks there along the southeast corner of the state. And Permian rocks are mainly sandstones and shales. That's because we were mainly inland at that time. By this time, the continents had totally come together. We were still very close to the equator. And there just aren't many fossils in the Permian rocks of Ohio. They're very rare. We do have some fossils of these animals. They're often called dinosaurs. They have nothing to do with dinosaurs. They're actually more closely related to us than they are to a dinosaur. We've got some bits and pieces of these animals from Permian rocks in Ohio. And then there's another chapter in the geologic history of Ohio. And for decades, it was a mystery. It occurs down in the southwest corner of the state, where Adams, Pike, and Highland County all come together at a point. And it's called the Serpent Mound structure. It's named that because it's in the same general area as the Serpent Mound built by early Native Americans. But it probably has nothing to do with the mound. It just happens to be in the same place. What the Serpent Mound structure is a circular area about 5 miles across. It has hills in the middle, a ring valley around those hills, and then another ring of hills around that. So they can actually see it from space, right? There's the hill in the middle. There's the Ring Valley. And there are the hills around that. And it's got the strangest geology in our entire state. Everywhere else in the state, the rocks are pretty flat. I mean, here we see these nice flat Ordovician rocks, the dark stuff, and the Silurian rocks above. You go to the excuse me, you go to the Serpent Mound, and the rocks are tilted all kinds of crazy angles. Also, you can find rocks that look like this, look like they've been shattered, pulverized, and then glued back together. Also, in most places, when you walk across the state, you can walk across miles of rocks from the same time period. Look at all that purple there, walking across Silurian age rocks. Look at all that blue. In the Serpent Mound, you start walking across that. First, you're on Silurian rocks, then Devonian, then Mississippian, then Devonian, then Silurian, then Ordovician, then Silurian, then Devonian, then Mississippian, then Silurian. And that's because if you look at the structure of the rocks, the center was uplifted about 1,000 feet above the surrounding area. And then around that, there was a valley that dropped down about 400 feet. And you rode that off, and you get the topography you see today with that hill in the middle. What the heck caused that? Well, for years, geologists tried to blame it on a volcano. They thought a volcano had burst through the crust here and gave us this structure. Well, problem with that is there are no volcanic rocks like these for hundreds of miles in any direction. So now we know it was caused by this. A meteorite came shooting in from outer space, a rock from space, came shooting in about 45,000 miles an hour. And when it hit, it made a crater. Now, when we think of crater, we tend to think of meteor crater there in Arizona. And that's pretty impressive. You stand on the edge of that and it's pretty impressive. It's about 3/4 of a mile wide, which to us mere humans is pretty big. But comparatively, it's a very small crater. It has this nice bowl shape. You look at big craters, they've got a different shape. Here's a big crater on the moon, Tycho. Notice the hump in the middle. There's a crater, another one on the moon, hump in the middle. There's another one on the moon. There's one on Mars. These big craters have these humps in the middle. And that's because when the really big meteorite hits, it actually pushes the crust down. And that crust bobs back up and freezes. So then you erode it down to that level and you get what we have at the Serpent Mound. At least that was what the geology was telling us. But just a few years ago, we had absolute proof that that's what happened. This is a single grain of sand under a geologist's microscope. And it's got an interesting feature. Notice it's got all these little tiny cracks in it. Those are called shock lamella or PDFs, planar deformation features. And they've been found in sand grains in only 2 kinds of places on our planet, where man has detonated nuclear bombs and places we know that meteorites have hit. And that grain I just showed you is from the Serpent Mound area. So we absolutely got hit by a meteorite. Now, when did that take place? Well, these things are really hard to date. The best evidence says it was probably sometime there in the Permian period, but we're really not sure on that because that's after we lost the record here in Ohio. Again, remember, we've got this huge time, 250 million years of missing history. So we're missing the entire time of the dinosaurs, unfortunately. We're missing all the rise of the mammals. And then there's a little bit of stuff dumped on us by the Ice Age. And I've got a whole talk on the Ice Age. We can maybe do that whole one some other time. But Ice Age deposits are very well represented in Ohio. All the colored area there is glacial deposits. And when glaciers move, they carry huge amounts of sand and gravel and rocks and boulders. And then when they melt, they drop all that stuff. And that stuff is called till, T-I-L-L. And the till allows us to tell how far the ice got. Now, sometimes the ice was moving forward at about the same rate as the front of the ice was melting back. So it acted like a giant conveyor belt, leaving these huge ridges of till called moraines. If you look at the moraines here in Ohio on a map, the dark green stripes, it look like garland on a Christmas tree. Each one represents a time when the glacier melted back and stopped a little bit, melted back and stopped a little bit, melted back and stopped a little bit. The average moraine in Ohio is about 50 feet tall. It's about 2 miles thick at its base. And some of these you can follow almost clear across the state. Now, the glaciers didn't just leave the hills. The glaciers also filled in the valleys. Here's an old river valley there. And there's the river valley. There's a man there for scale. And all the rest of that is glacial debris. That is why Western Ohio is so flat. It's flat as a fritter out there. Here's a picture I took right along Interstate 70, right near Springfield, and it is flat. Right where I took this photo is a buried valley, 400 feet deep, entirely filled with glacial debris. A lot of people here in Central Ohio have these big decorative rocks in their front yards. And if you look closely at these rocks, you realize these aren't Ohio rocks. I mean, Ohio's bedrock is sandstone and limestone and shale. These are igneous and metamorphic rocks. They're schist and gneiss and granite. These aren't from Ohio. These are from Canada. They're called erratics, glacial erratics. I've got a wonderful one right outside my office there at Orton Hall, and this one weighs an estimated 17 tons. And it was these rocks carried in the bottom of the moving glaciers that carved the famous glacial grooves up at Kelly's Island. Ohio is famous also for its Ice Age fossils. Few of the most common kinds of large animal that lived here in Ohio during the Ice Age was an animal called the mastodon, a very primitive relative of modern day elephants. And they like to live in the forested areas, especially ones near ponds and bogs and swamps. So often one of these animals would get stuck and couldn't get out. And it's thought that every wetland in Ohio has a mastodon skeleton somewhere underneath it. The other kind of Ice Age animal, elephant that lived here in Ohio was the mammoth, like the woolly mammoth. These are much rarer. We've got over half a dozen good mastodon skeletons. We've got one sort of halfway decent mammoth skeleton here in Ohio. And that's because Ice Age Ohio had a lot more forested areas, which the mastodons like, than we had open areas that the mammoth preferred. We also have these guys. Ain't he handsome? This is the giant ground sloth. Right? And actually 4 skeletons of this animal have been found in Ohio. And I've got one at my museum, the Orton Museum. This one's about 30% complete. It was found in Holmes County, right, in 1890. Wasn't dug up by a scientist. It was dug up by a farmer who was just trying to drain a field, which is probably why we only have 30%. The best one of these was found in Dark County in 1971. That's on exhibit at the Boonshaft over in Dayton. The most interesting one was a very partial one found up near Toledo. And that's got cut marks from stone tools. So that one was butchered. And I have no idea what sloth tastes like. If anyone knows, please let me know. I've been asking what sloth tastes like for years, and I haven't found anyone who's eaten a sloth. I also had these guys, animals called cervalsi, sort of like a big moose type animal. We also had muskox, relatives of goats. And we had 2 different species of muskox here in Ohio. We had this one, the Arctic muskox, and that was here in Ohio when the glaciers were really close. You may know that the ice didn't come down and melt back once. It came down and melted back at least 18 times. And this one would have been here when the ice was close and things were very cold. And at those times when the ice melted back, we had a different species of muskox called the woodland muskox. In fact, just a few years ago, a beautiful skull of one of these was found over in Hebron, just south of Newark. And you can see that on exhibit here at the Ohio History Center. We also had bison here in Ohio. In fact, we had two different species. We had the modern one, or at least the progenitor of the modern one. And we also had one called bison latifrons that had horns that were 6 feet across. That must have been a spectacular sight. We also had an awful lot of these peccaries, genus Platygonus. If any of you are familiar with an animal in the American Southwest called the javelina, very close relative of the animal we had here in Ohio during the Ice Age. And we also had a giant beaver here in Ohio. Beaver is big as a small bear. Here are two jaws from a cave up in Wyandotte County. The lower jaw is from a modern day species of beaver. The upper one is this giant Ice Age beaver called Castoroides ohioensis. Been found all over North America, but the first one was discovered here in Ohio near Zanesville, about the time of the American Civil War. And we also had a giant bear here in Ohio. The skeleton in white is a modern day grizzly, compared to the skeleton in black, which is this Ice Age bear called Arctodus, the short-faced bear. Now, one animal that we haven't found in Ohio, but we really wish we could, this animal, the saber-toothed cat. Fossils of this animal have been found in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Indiana. It has not been found in Ohio. It had to have lived here. So hopefully the next call I get will be a farmer saying, I've got some bones in my field, and we'll go there and find Ohio's first saber-tooth. So that is a very quick history through about 400 million years of Earth history, and it's only the tip of the iceberg. But now I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. So feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
I'll go first.
All right.
Okay, I'm reading a book right now called Atlantic, and he's just done kind of a history of the Atlantic Ocean and geologic history, industrial history, military history. But
cool.
The end of the book, he's talking about the warming seas, and it was published in 2010, and he's talking about the question of, is the warming going on right now part of a large cycle? Is it man-made or is it a mix? And I just wondered what your take on that is in 2021.
Right now, our climate should be sort of stable in between advances and retreats. And it just seems to be warming much too quickly to be anything natural. We don't know of any time in Earth history where things have warmed that fast, that quickly. So, yep, I don't think we try and sneak out of the blame, but I don't think we can.
It's like I told Carl yesterday, I'm not optimistic about the long-term survivability of human beings.
Yep.
I don't know.
Yeah, we've done too much to the planet, but who knows? Maybe we can still find a way. I'm an optimist, but that's not based on science, unfortunately. Ask away. So,
I have another question.
Talk about this all day.
Can you say anything about sort of the history of like our determining that it was a meteorite strike down by Serpent Mound? Because sometimes that's an interesting story about, well, we thought it was this, and then there'd be like, disagreements, and it's sometimes an interesting story about how we came to a consensus.
That is a great story. The main thing that pushed it over was some drilling done there by the Ohio Geological Survey. They put down a couple drills there and pulled up some very interesting rocks that showed that, if it came from below, you would find more deformation below and less as you got to the top. If the hit came from above, you'd find more disruption at the top than you would down towards the bottom. And that's what they found, as well as finding that one sand grain. Well, they found more than that one, but they found the one I pictured among the sand grains that proved that it was a meteorite strike. And it just fits. It fits the geography of it. It fits the timing and everything. Everything just sort of fits so well. Whereas the volcano and any other explanation just doesn't fit the data.
So before they did that drilling, I mean, certainly there would have been like heated discussion before that, like.
Oh yeah, yeah, a lot of heated discussion. And now we know it's one of only about a dozen of these scattered around the Midwest. There's about a dozen of these buried craters scattered around the Midwest. So now, we used to think that meteorites were there. Now we know they're just a normal part of Earth's history. They've been over 200 meteorite craters have been found on our planet, which is pretty good considering how much has been eroded and moved around and covered up and eroded and stuff. So yeah, we've got over 200 meteorite craters on our planet now.
So I'd been to Meteor Crater, Arizona, and I remember them talking about there was, I mean, that one seems kind of obvious looking at it now, but back in the day, they were not so sure for quite a while.
Yeah. Well, that one's so obvious because it's very recent. It's only about 50,000 years old, which is geologically just yesterday. But yeah, that was when they didn't believe in meteorites coming that often. In fact, they even tried to drill for iron ore there. They don't realize that these come in so fast that they essentially destroy themselves when they hit. So there was no iron left for them to mine.
Yeah, I remember that. I think the guy bought the area and he spent an insane amount of money because he calculated how much iron, how big the asteroid would have been. And they've just found nothing there.
Yeah, because they didn't realize the amount of kinetic energy. I mean, these things are coming in about 45,000 miles an hour. That's faster than a rifle bullet. And with that much energy, it just destroys themselves when they hit.
So when they're investigating the meteor strike around Serpent Mound, I mean, what year was that? And were they just much more open to the idea of being a meteor then because it was so much later?
Yeah. By this time, the idea that the dinosaurs had been killed by one was becoming fairly well accepted. I forget the exact year they did the drilling down there at Serpent Mound, but it was about 12 years ago. I'd have to look that up.
Oh, wow. That recent. Okay. I thought you were going to say like 1850 years.
Oh, no. This is quite recent. There. Yeah.
So 20 years ago, they didn't realize that there was a meteor strike?
Not there, no. The one of the dinosaurs that killed the dinosaurs, that wasn't postulated until 1980. So that's this whole big turnaround in geology thinking about meteorites is rather recent, just the last 40 years or so.
I have a question about the Tejas River, or is that too recent? That was originally was up around this area, wasn't? And the glaciers pushed it south. Am I completely wrong on that?
Yeah, that was a pre-glacial river system that was very big and very extensive. And today it's just represented by some of these deep valleys. That deep valley I mentioned over by Springfield, that's part of that system. Dayton gets most of its water from one of these buried valleys. Yeah, that's all part of that pre-glacial river system. So, yep.
I have a question. I think you had mentioned that during the Pennsylvanian period, you were talking about how you don't like insects and the insects were very large.
Yeah.
I thought I've read something about this, but perhaps you can explain this better. Were there certain conditions at that time or different periods in Earth's history that made such large, what we would regard as such large animals or insects more prevalent?
Yeah, as far as that time, it was a much higher oxygen levels. Right now, oxygen is 21% of our atmosphere. At that time, it probably got up to 30. And insects don't breathe like we do. They don't suck air in and out like we do with our lungs. They just have these holes in their exoskeleton that air sort of, diffuses in. And in a atmosphere of what we've got today, there just isn't enough oxygen pressure to push enough oxygen into a big insect. But back then, with oxygen so much higher, 30%, there was enough oxygen that was sort of pushing its way in so they could get a lot bigger at that time. So the increased oxygen didn't cause the insects to become bigger, it allowed them to become bigger. I think that's a very important point to make.
Well, that's interesting. And so like then over, I guess, long geological periods, the oxygen level has gone up and down, obviously.
Yeah.
And so are we in any kind of a trend right now? Is it going up or down, or what's like, how's it working like in the last, let's say 10,000, 20,000?
Boy, that's something I know absolutely nothing about. It'd be interesting to do a web search on that, but that's, yeah, totally out of my area of knowledge. I'm sorry. Good question, though. Good question.
I sort of a speculative question. What is the one question that you would really like to see answered before you become part of the dust?
Oh my goodness. Boy, that is a good question. I may have to think about that for a long time. Holy mackerel, that's a good one. I would like us to really figure out how life started on this planet.
Ah, yeah,
I think that would be the neat thing. I mean, there's
that would be.
recently I read a book on all the experiments scientists are doing to try and figure out how life might have started. And oh my, I mean, I'm a fairly intelligent guy and I'm a scientist, but I'm no chemist. And I found that book very tough sledding.
It's like reading Stephen Hawking.
My goodness. I think that's the one thing I'd really like to know. How did life start on this planet, and whether there's life on other planets? Now we've got evidence of life on this planet at least as back as 3.5 billion years, maybe as early as 4.1, which means that life started on this planet almost as soon as conditions were right for it. It's almost as if life is just a natural part of a planet's evolution, just like, quartz crystals. And if that's the case, with the thousands of exoplanets that have been discovered, life is probably very, very common in the universe. But I wouldn't expect aliens to be calling anytime soon, because for the first 4 billion years of our planet's history, we were the planet of slime. The biggest animals were bacteria and algae. So it seems like, although life itself is easy to get started, those next steps, multi-cells, hard parts, those seem to have been a lot harder to get. So the life, the universe might be filled with life, but it might all be slime, like we were for 4/5 of our history. Of course, that's all based on a sample size of one, our planet. Great question. Great question.
When you're talking about the glaciers or the sea rising, I think in the Pennsylvania period, you mentioned that the glaciers causing that were in Africa, that was in the South Pole. So where was Antarctica then?
Well, I'd have to look at the maps from that time. I think it was connected to Africa. I think that was still fairly south as well.
Okay.
Yep. And those glacier advances and retreats, just like the modern ice age, the so-called Pleistocene, where we had at least 18 of these advances and retreats, and we had at least 30, 40, 50 back in the Pennsylvanian. Those are caused by what are called Milankovitch cycles, which is the relationship between the Earth and the sun. There's 3 cycles that seem to control this. One is how circular or oval our orbit is. The second is how much our axis is tilted. And the third is the direction the axis is pointing in. Right now it points to Polaris, the North Star, but the Earth wobbles and sometimes it points to a different star, Vega.
Mhm.
No one of these cycles by itself seems able to trigger one of these glacial advances. But when you add up the three things, the cycles match very well, the coming and going of the ice, both for the modern ice age, the last 500,000 years, and the ones back in the Pennsylvanian period that produced our coal deposits.
Mhm.
They're called Milankovitch cycles because they were figured out by a Serbian mathematician while he was a prisoner of war in the First World War.
Jeez.
Yeah, look up Milankovitch cycles. It's pretty interesting stuff.
Okay. Thanks.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why is there the missing periods in Ohio, the 250 million years that are missing? Why are they missing?
We were above sea level. And what happened when you're above sea level when you get rain? It carries stuff away. It doesn't dump stuff on you. So we were above sea level for that whole period, which means, you know, there were dinosaurs here, certainly. Dinosaurs were land animals, but, you know, all their bones and stuff were washed away with any sediment that would have buried them. So all Ohio dinosaurs are now out in the Gulf buried. They're producing the oil deposits that we're getting now. Yeah, I wish. I mean, the closest dinosaur fossils to Ohio, there's some really nice footprints over at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and some very fragmentary dinosaur bones in Western Tennessee. But those are the closest dinosaurs we have, at least dinosaur fossils we have to Ohio. Which is why I spent 13 summers going to Montana to dig dinosaurs.
Well, a follow-up on that, have you been to Western Australia to see I guess those are the oldest rocks that we can see on planet Earth?
I would love to. I mean, Australia's on my bucket list. I would love to go there. There's so much geology there. It's just spectacular. Yeah, the oldest crystals on our planet are known from that place. A place called the North Pole because it's so hot. Yeah, and some of those crystals go back to about 4.4, no, not that old, 4.3, 4.2 billion years. Yeah, it's just amazing, those zircon crystals. The oldest actual rocks we've got come from Greenland. And the oldest fossils are much younger, about 3.5 billion. So,
I don't want to dominate, but I could sit here and ask you questions all day long, but this is kind of a political question, but the last 4 years, has anything in your area of research, or just generally speaking from the scientific viewpoint, did we back up? Did we take a halt? Or I guess the science deniers that were in government, have they hurt science knowledge in our country to an extent?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's no question that they've hurt just by putting so much doubt on science. I mean, there's a physical reality out there that needs to be acknowledged. And the trouble with reality is if you ignore it, it has a way of coming back to bite you. I think we've seen that with the COVID. I think we're seeing that with climate change. So you need to be aware that there's this physical reality that you can't ignore, even if it's inconvenient politically.
I have a question or a thought. I think it would be very interesting over the course of, say, the next 100 or 200 years, if we could start doing more geological exploration in places like Mars and Venus. It would be fascinating to compare their development geologically with what happened here on Earth. I mean, obviously to see if there's ever life on those planets, but I mean, clearly compared to Earth, there wasn't as much life, and to see how the geology of those planets evolved and how it compares to what we can determine from Earth.
Yeah, comparison is always valuable. I suspect the geology there won't be nearly as interesting because those other planets tend not to have plate tectonics. And that's what gave us so much of our neat geology, the crashing together and the pulling apart and everything else. But still, any comparison is neat. I mean, like I said, we've got a sample size of 1. It's not much of a sample size. So,
How long ago was it that plate tectonics finally became accepted?
that would have been 1970 was when the really big change took place at a couple of conferences.
Is that when they also decided that the continents coming together was a thing?
Well, that's when they decided they knew the continents were moving. You know, it took them a while to get back beyond Pangea, because every time you put them together and break them apart, it gets harder to, the further back in time you go, it gets harder to put the pieces back together. So they first had to confirm Pangea, which is what happened there in 70. And then they've been gradually working their way back. Now we've got about 5 of these supercontinents in Earth history. But again, each one further back in time is a little less convincing. But they're put back together based mainly on magnetics. When a volcano, all the little iron minerals in it line up with the magnetic poles. So you arrange these rocks till all the north poles point to the same point, and all the south poles point to the same point.
Okay. Wow.
And I guess you'd also have to take into account that North Pole and the South Pole switch every, what, 10,000 years, or
Yeah,
no, it's
they
more
do.
than 10,000.
They flip flop.
I don't remember the
randomly.
time. Oh,
Yeah,
it's more random?
Mhm.
Okay.
Well, and as far as plate tectonics go, I think that it was posited well before 1970. I know I have references in some of my aquarium hobbyist books that people were saying, hey, we've got very similar species of animals or very similar, you know, like for instance,
Oh,
cichlids,
yeah.
South American
Definitely.
cichlids, African cichlids. And they were positing, of course, that, you know, South America kind of fit very nicely against Africa,
Oh, absolutely.
kind of like a jigsaw
That was
puzzle,
noticed-
but it took
Yeah,
getting
that-
the evidence.
That shape was noticed as soon as the first maps were made of
Yeah.
the coast. That was back in the 1500s. People suggested they were together. And yeah, you said a lot of the biology of it suggested that. But geologists didn't buy it really much until around 1970. One of the reasons was, if you look at a continent is essentially a hunk of granite floating on what's below it. And it's sort of like an iceberg, and an iceberg has most of it below, and so does a continent.
Mm.
I just thought, how can you get this thing with this huge root plowing its way through the lower layers? They just didn't see any way that could happen. And it wasn't until plate tectonics came along and said, well, it doesn't have to plow through, it's actually just being carried by that lower layer. And that's allowing the continents to move around. The main difference between continental drift and plate tectonics is the continents are not the plates. The continents are just these pieces that happen to be floating on the plates. But the continents are not the plates themselves.
Well, I want to thank you and your colleagues at Ohio State. When I was an undergraduate there, even as a Bachelor of Arts, I had to take a 10-hour sequence of science, and I chose geology. And I am so glad I did, because geology makes travel so much more interesting. When we finally flew over the basin and range out west, it's like, okay. And you go to the Grand Canyon and it makes so much more sense. And it just makes travel so much more interesting. To know an uplift mountain versus a glacial mountain. And I've been to Glacier National Park. It made it much more interesting. So I wish I could remember the name of the professor I had. They were both wonderful, and it was hard. Oh my gosh. I mean, my physical geology course was tough.
Yeah. There's a lot to learn. There's so much. I mean, it's a big planet, and it's got a long history. And I'm teaching the earth science course right now. So we just had an exam yesterday, I think it was. Yeah,
Well,
Friday.
Gabe,
Yeah, yesterday.
When we can finally all come out of social distancing, one of the state parks that I know of in Ohio, Christmas Rocks, or sorry, it's a state nature preserve, actually straddles that line between the glaciated and unglaciated parts of Ohio. And it's a really, really neat hike, because you can see, if you know what to look for, how those glaciers have impacted the topography, and then how the topography and the underlying geology impacted the biotopes that are growing in that area. It's
Absolutely.
absolutely fascinating.
I'm not familiar with that. Where's that park located?
Christmas Rocks is a little bit south and west of Clear Creek Metro Park.
Alrighty.
So it's that same general area southwest of Lancaster.
Mm-hmm. I'll have to go see that sometime. Is that a really new park?
It's a state nature preserve, so it wasn't until about 4 years ago or so that they actually opened it up to the public. Before then, it had been by permit only.
Okay.
And it's still not well known because of that.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Frogs. Never heard of that. Thanks, Catherine. I want to see that too.
Well, again, if we can ever come out of social distancing, maybe that would be a good outing for the, for HCCO to do some time.
Clear Creek's a wonderful park.
Yeah.
I love Clear Creek. That's a fun park. And John Bryan's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
John Bryan's neat.
Yeah. Clifton Gorge. When we think of Ohio, we think of the Till Plains. We think of those lovely flatlands out west, western part of the state. And we forget about the diversity. It's just like when you think about like Browns Lake Bog. We have bogs in Ohio. We don't realize we have bogs because we don't think of us as having, these nice acidic bogs and these alkaline fens. Again, many cases by courtesy of the glaciers. But there's so much to explore, and hopefully once again, we can actually go out and all get together. We can go do that, as a group.
How can you tell the difference? Is there a way? I know when we're out driving through areas, I think they're called kettle lakes, versus a man-made pond. Is there a way?
Tough. Yeah, Kettle Lake is formed when a big chunk of the ice falls off the front and gets buried in glacial debris. So when the ice melts, it leaves a low spot, and if that low spot fills with water, that forms what's called a kettle lake. But how you would tell that from made by man, I don't know, because that'd be I think if you would probably take a core of it, you could probably tell just from the debris on the bottom. That's probably the only way you could really tell would be to core it.
I had read someplace that I think it's down near Cincinnati at Cedar Creek Park that people just like us can go down there and actually we're allowed to go in and get fossils. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah. Cedar Creek,
really?
about 60 miles southwest of here. It's right there where there's a big flea market there, and it's also where you would for the Ohio Renaissance Festival. Yeah, it's Cedar Creek State Park. It's Ordovician. You can go there and you can keep any fossils smaller than your hand that you find. And there are fossils everywhere. You can't walk there without stepping on fossils. And the best way to collect there is to find a spot, get down on your butt and put your nose about 4 inches from the ground and pick over every pebble, and you'll find all kinds of neat fossils. You'll find brachiopods, which are sort of like clams on the outside. You'll find bryozoans, which are little tree-like things. You'll find, if you're lucky, little rolled up trilobites. You find cephalopods, which are related to modern chambered nautilus. So there's a lot of neat stuff there to find.
I have a number of fossils from Caesars Creek State Park. What Dr. Gnidovec said about getting down close to the ground, take a small child with you and turn them loose. That works even better. But it really is. When we went.
Oh, yeah. Kids are that way. I mean, I remember once I was leading a group of kids to a fossil site around Alum Creek. And I held up, this is a brachiopod, you'll find these, and this is a hornco, you'll find these. And I held up a shark tooth. These are very rare. You won't find any of these. Well, within 2 minutes, some kid came up with a shark tooth. That's not fair. You're closer to the ground.
Yeah, and that would be another great outing for this group, to go down, because it is a really fun day. There's a lot of other stuff in the area. And quite literally, pretty much every rock you pick up in that spillway is going to have some sort of fossil, either an imprint or a partial, or if you're lucky, a full fossil in it.
Absolutely.
The thing the only thing that they asked, at least when I was there, and it's been quite a while, was that you go down to the visitor center, sign the form that says, you know, I understand the risk, blah, blah, blah. I'm not going to hold the park responsible,
No.
you know, and agree to like not climb up the walls of the spillway and you know, rip the rocks apart. But it really is a neat place to go, and to see those fossils and to hold something that old in your hand is just kind of mind boggling when you think about it.
Yep, and
I guess this,
Cincinnati is a wonderful place to visit as well.
I was just saying another sort of political question, but not really. It's practical too. The state of science education, just overall in the United States, where do you see it right now? And are we moving in the right or wrong direction in 2021?
I think we've been slowly moving in the wrong direction for years. Standards seem to have slipped. They're just not teaching as much information. It's wonderful to have all these things about getting kids, you know, enjoying school and stuff, but there's a certain amount of basic information that everyone needs to know. And I don't think we've been imparting that to our youngsters for some time now. I know memorization isn't the most fun thing, but sometimes it's necessary. You can't be a geologist unless you know the geological time scale. You can't be a geologist unless you know the difference between a basalt and a granite and a sandstone and a limestone. Some things you just have to know.
Wow. That's all I can think of right at the moment. So,
Yep.
so,
Dr. Gnidovec, I have one more question for you. It's been probably over a decade ago. You were actually doing a talk up at a Lithic and Lapidary Society in Mansfield. And at that time, you'd mentioned you were working on a mastodon excavation over in Darke County. How did that ever work out?
Oh, that was one of the most fun things I've ever done. That was one of these cases where one of the things I do at the museum is identify stuff. Rocks, minerals, fossils, bones, teeth. I don't do artifacts. I don't know pottery or pyramids or you know, arrowheads or anything like that, but I know people who do.
yeah.
And farmers called me up from Darke County and said, I've got some dinosaur bones in my field. And I said, probably not, but why don't you bring in something to show me? And I thought he'd bring in some old cow bones or horse bones, and he brought in a mastodon tooth that was just beautiful. So we went out to his farm. I ran that as an educational dig. I ran it for 5 summers, and we ended up excavating a mastodon. It's not one that you can put up on exhibit anywhere because the bones were all busted up. And we discovered later through looking at old air photos that the area had been bulldozed many years previously. But it was a great educational dig. I had school classes out there. I had teachers out there teaching them how to dig, how to identify bones, how to map them in. You get 40 third graders in the mud. It's a lot of fun. So it was a very good educational dig. Scientifically, I don't think we got anything interesting out of it. I sent the bones off for radiocarbon dating to the best guy in the field, and he tried and tried and tried, and he couldn't get anything worth dating out of it. He said the water table had gone up and down, up and down, up and down, and just had leached out anything of value from the bones. So we didn't even get a date out of that. But educationally, I think it was invaluable. I've got all those bones at the museum. Again, most of them are busted up. Most of them are still in their plaster jackets. But again, educationally, it was wonderful. And that was near the little town, or in the little town of Rossburg, there in Darke County, just north there of Greenville. So just north of one of Ohio's best Ice Age sites, the Carter Farm site, excavated in 1970, 71, where that complete ground sloth at the Dayton Museum is now.
Yeah, and if you want to get kids hooked on science, those kinds of experiences are the way to do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, one of the kids that was on that dig is now one of the people that when the construction team finds bones, they call him to determine if they're human or animal bones. And when we raised money for that dinosaur, he came and gave us $1,000. He said, you helped me find my career. And not only that, but his dad gave us $1,000 because we helped his son find his career. So yeah, those things for kids are invaluable.
Did you know Paul Shuley over in the anthropology? Did you ever work with Paul Shuley over in the anthropology department at Ohio State? Yeah, because he used to get called in to identify. Yeah, he did human bone identification.
Mm-hmm.
Great teacher, extremely bright man. A lot of fun in class too.
Yeah.
We teased him about his hair.
Yeah.
Great. Anybody else, or we all questioned out?
One more last one, just a kind of a fun question. What's the most crackpot theory out there right now in your area of expertise that you would like all of us to know that it's absolutely bunk?
There are still some people believe that non-avian dinosaurs and humans live together, and there's no way. I mean, we know over 1,000 species of dinosaur. We know tens of thousands of bones. They've been found all over the planet. With not a single dinosaur bone, we found a single solitary bone of a human. Not only that, we've not found a single solitary bone of a cat, a dog, a horse, a cow, a sheep, a goat, chicken, pig, any of the other animals that are associated with man. It's just ridiculous to think that. But there are still people who believe it. Go down to the Creationist Museum, and I haven't been there. I won't give them a nickel, but they still believe that dinosaurs and man live together, and it's just crazy. Now I know birds are dinosaurs, but that's sort of getting around the point there. Anyway.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. I could talk about this
Thanks.
all day. Invite me back. I'd love to do my
Thank you.
evolution talk.
We will.
I think my evolution talk would be great for this group.
Yes, absolutely.
Hopefully this time next year we'll be able to get together in person and.
Yeah, I hope. Yeah, vaccines are coming. So
I would really love to hear a talk on kind of scientifically how the history of how we got to some of these ideas, like that question I was asking about, how we decided it was a meteor. And I know, like, especially with Meteor Crater, Arizona, that was a very interesting story how we got to that. And the plate tectonics, and there's got to be a lot of very interesting past controversies that now are consensus.
Oh yeah.
Oh, come on. Scientists don't have egos, do they?
Oh no.
Well, even beyond the ego, I mean, it's not,
yeah,
it looks like this, it looks like that. One scientist takes up one side, the other side. I mean, yeah, I think it kind of has to work like that. It doesn't have to be really super confrontational, but sometimes it is, and that's okay.
A book you would like is called The Great Devonian Controversy.
Yeah?
You would like that? You should
Okay.
sometime. I just had the author in my mind and it ran out the back door. Boy, that happens a lot now. But yeah, that's the one I think you would enjoy. And there's a bunch of really neat books out there on the controversy about whether the dinosaurs were killed by the meteorite or not. There's some great books on that controversy. Yep, and some on the plate tectonics as well. So,
John, I'm aware of a book called, I think it's just called Mammoth. And what it is explores how scientists came to understand that the creature called a mammoth really existed. Because the mammoth was one of the, Dr. Gnidovec, you obviously know more about this than I do, but my understanding is that the mammoth was like the first, what we would call prehistoric creature that was really identified as a true living creature in a prehistoric time.
Yeah.
Because, for example, mammoth bones were found in Europe, and the Europeans couldn't figure out why are they here. So, like, there were theories, for example, like, well, they came with Hannibal and the Carthaginians when they invaded Rome. They brought elephants with them. but they kept finding so many of them they couldn't explain it. And they would find like these bones of elephants in Siberia. There was this whole industry in Siberia where they would harvest elephant tusk and they would sell them because there were so many of them there. And so, well, how did they get there? Well, the Great Flood washed the mammoths up there. But over time, eventually people started figuring out that these theories just didn't work. And so the mammoth was like the first time that scientists figured out, oh yeah, there are things happening here that we just have no record of. So that's a good readable book too. I think it's just called Mammoth.
Okay, thanks.
Another really useful reference I've
I've
kept on hand is the Roadside Guide to the Geology of Ohio.
Mhm.
That's been just a nice book for me to have around, give me an
That's-
idea of this,
Yeah.
in layman's terms, what some of this stuff means.
Yeah, Mark did a great job on that book. Mark from the University of Toledo, I think. Or no, Bowling Green. I think he's from Bowling Green. Great job.
One thing I have found as I go through, I like to go down to the book loft. It's one of my two favorite places. There's just some great science writing out there right now that's accessible to the lay person nowadays. I think at least that's what I have found. If you want to go look, there's really good stuff. I love E.O. Wilson. Got to read Carl Sagan's book at some point because it's a classic, but it's out there if you want to find it.
Mhm.
Have you written any books that we should know about?
No, haven't written any books. I just write that one column in the Dispatch every 5 weeks.
Okay. I always read it.
Thank you. It's fun to do. So.
His and I like yours, and Steve Rissing. I like his too. Just a little bit of sanity out there in the world.
Yeah, Brad Lepper, the archaeologist, is good.
Yep, I know Brad a little bit. We were supposed to do a little survey together at my great grandfather's farm one day, and it poured rain. We didn't get to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Brad's a good guy.
Yep.
Another one you should get to know is the Dave Dyer, curator of natural history at Ohio History. He's a really good guy, really knowledgeable and real friendly. So,
Where's he? Dave Dyer, you say?
Dave Dyer, Ohio History Center.
Oh, okay.
Curator of natural history there. Took over when Bob retired about 5-6 years ago.
That's my other favorite place. I'm an official volunteer up there. So I do those brown signs you see around the state, the history markers. Those are fun.
Oh, cool. Neat.
And there's a lot of those that cover geologic issues I've found. We're trying.
Good. Well,
Is the museum open right now, or is it closed because of COVID?
Orton Museum is closed for 2 reasons. First, COVID, and second, we're under some renovation.
Okay.
There's subscription stuff all over the museum. I can't even get to some of the exhibits. So hopefully in about 2 months,
Wow.
be up and running again. But I suspect that's optimistic, the way OSU moves. You want to change a light bulb? Well, it'll take you 3 months.
We're talking geologic time here.
Yeah, really. I mean, the glaciers move faster than OSU.
But it takes a lot of committees to change a light bulb. You know?
Yeah.
We got that dinosaur. You would think, getting the funds, $80,000 in a month would be hard. That was easy compared to getting the permission to have them raise the lights enough so the skeleton would fit. Shit.
Oh my gosh.
Academia. It's wonderful.
It's not even academia, it's called bureaucracy.
It's corporate, governmental, institutional. It's everywhere. Yeah.
Hey, where was that glacier that you had in your slides? It was a glacier that was on the ground, not in the water.
Yeah, that was
And
Greenland.
that was Greenland. Okay. Because I've seen the glaciers in Iceland, but the one that I saw, it was calving off into a glacier lagoon. And the ones that I've seen in valleys, they all, at least, I guess I didn't get to walk up to the one in the valley, but it looked like it just kind of tapered down. I'd never seen one that was just like this wall
Mhm.
on land. It was a wall on the water.
Mhm.
That one was a wall, but on the land, they just kind of tapered down. So that was in Greenland like that.
That's interesting. Geology rocks.
It's got to be from Richard.
Yeah, I just now noticed that.
It does have to be. That's a nice pun.
Yeah, that is a
Oh
good.
boy.
Gneiss.
The name that I put up there, the name of the author, Martin Rudwick, that wrote the Great Devonian Controversy.
That's it, Rudwick. That was the guy I was trying to think of.
Thank you, Amazon.
Yep.
It's good for research.
All right.
Any other questions?
Not right now. Sure, I'll think of some later.
Thanks a lot. Very interesting.
Because if they come up with a question later, they can just shoot me an email. I'll be happy to answer it. Sometimes with talks like this, you think, no, damn, I should have asked that question while I had them. By email.
That'd be great.
Yeah, that would be. Thank you.
And again, I'm always willing to identify stuff: rocks, minerals, fossils, bones, teeth. Again, I don't know artifacts, but I know people who can. So.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if I find something in my hayfield, I'll know who to bring it to. And since we have horses, I guarantee it won't be a horse bone. So, 'cause I already know what those look like.
Oh yeah, we've got 3 hay burners.
Yeah. I just added up how much we paid in hay last year.
My wife takes care of all that. Thank goodness.
Hey, you don't want to know.
Every 6 weeks they get new shoes. 6 weeks for new shoes. I get shoes by every 3 years.
Oh,
Yeah, but you don't weigh 2,000 pounds, so.
No. Since we've been cooped up at home, my wife's been doing a lot more cooking and baking.
Well, that has been a side benefit. My wife's found some really good recipes, and she's a wonderful cook and baker. So she just made a chocolate chip bread loaf the other day that's hard to stay out.
Next meeting is at his house.
Hey, she would be more than happy to cook for it. Trust me.
Post your address in chat. She'll mail it to you.
Wait, if we have the picnic, I guarantee you she will be bringing lots of stuff. I hope we
It's when
can.
we go, yeah, it's when we go back to in-person meetings and we can start bringing things to share with people again.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, this has been a lot of fun.
Well, we appreciate you taking your time, Dr. Gnidovec, because we always like having you here,
Always.
as a speaker.
Always fun.
You're one of our favorite people to have visit with us.
Well, there's a lot more to talk about 4.5 million years. So dinosaurs I could talk about for the rest of the week. So anyway.
excellent. All right. Well,
All right. Well, I'm going to sign off and go get some lunch.
all right. Sounds good. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.